Hello students, I am Dr. L.K. Das, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of HSS IIT Roorkee. Welcome to another lecture of the NPTEL course Power and Politics in Contemporary India, a Sociological View. Today we are entering a new week and we have a new topic for discussion, and this topic is about development. How do we understand development, how do we understand sociology of development, and how do we understand the critique of development in terms of post-development as well as non-development. Now, development is a term that we all think that we understand because we all want development, and most often than not we associate development with economic growth. Sometimes we associate it with modernization, and many a times, particularly in the post Second World War period, we have associated it with planned social change. Now, when we associate development with economic growth, that means that economy triumphs over everything else, and this economic growth has no baggages of your society, no baggages of your community, no baggages regarding morality, no baggages at all. And this is what some scholars would argue: growth for the sake of growth. If you have 1 rupee, then you need to add 1 more, and you have to keep adding 1 till time immemorial or till infinity. On the other hand, you cannot have it just as it is. It requires certain ideological justification. And when we speak about ideological justification, that also means that what kind of ideology are we talking about? Are we saying an ideology that places one group of country over another group of country and place a glass ceiling in between, and we call them modern countries or advanced countries, and we call them backward countries? Now, through the process of modernization and planned social change, the idea is that these backward countries will break this glass ceiling and become advanced countries or advanced economic societies. Sociology and political sociology is very interested in this because it says that economic growth for the sake of growth is like cancer, because only a cancerous cell grows for the sake of growth. So, in this way, this economic growth is parasitical on class, caste, gender and regional inequalities. So, that is the reason why in this discussion we will look at how this idea of development emerged, particularly in the Indian context, and how sociologically we can deconstruct it and look at the multiple dimensions. Now, development in the Indian context is not what we see it in the current period. Rather, the early nationalists, starting from the late 19th century and early 20th century, spoke about lack of development during the colonial period. As a matter of fact, Dadabhai Naoroji would argue that India is undeveloped or underdeveloped or poor primarily because there is a drain of wealth from India to Britain, and all the surplus that is being generated here is not getting utilized for the development of this country itself. So, while Britain becomes industrialized, Britain becomes economically superior and there is economic growth, India becomes poor and poor. So, this is happening in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So all they wanted was that the nationalist leaders, they planned it out. They had resolutions, for example, like the Wardha resolution of 1938, in which they spoke about national reconstruction and what are the different ways through which this national reconstruction would happen. It would happen particularly by something called a planning commission. And this planning commission, although it started officially in 1950, it had its precedence from the early 1930s, in which the Planning Commission of India was chaired by Jawaharlal Nehru, and he very famously argued that let us keep this vehicle of economic development as Planning Commission outside the frame of politics. So while in politics you have different opinions, different viewpoints within Planning Commission, and for the national reconstruction we need to have planners, we need to have engineers, we need to have bureaucrats whose only goal is the development of this country. And once they do it, they come together, they can build dams, industries and institutions that would symbolize sovereignty, pride and modernity. Nehru famously called dams at the temples of modern India. So everywhere there were the dams, they were constructed, Nehru would go and inaugurate it and celebrate it. Look at the movies, Hindi movies particularly, as well as regional movies of 1950s and 1960s. The way they glorified construction of dams, industries and other kind of institutions. IITs, IIMs, many the institutions of national and international repute were created during this period for development of the country. So IITs were created so that India would feel sovereign in terms of technological power. IIMs were created so that we have bureaucrats who are highly educated in management. It's a different matter that when IITs and IIMs and graduates from these institutions, they came out, rather than serving the country, they went to the foreign shores and served them. So let us not discuss those issues right now, because we will be jumping our story. So sovereignty was associated with pride and also modernity. So when we are talking about modernity, so Nehru and others have to be discussed, because whether it was Nehru, whether it was Ambedkar, everyone said that they have faith in science, technology and rational planning. And they were quite fascinated by Soviet Union, the way a completely agrarian society over 2 to 3 decades became a completely urbanized one, where when people moved from rural areas to urban areas, rather than living in slums, the state prioritized the industry, the state prioritized housing for them, and ultra cheap or the highly subsidized houses were provided so that they would not be residing in slums. So but this was done through rational planning, and this rational planning was about 5-year plans. So in all the 5-year plans till almost 1990, what we witness is a priority towards agriculture and also a priority towards heavy industry and infrastructure. So all the commanding heights of industries were taken care of by the public sector, whether it was Steel Authority of India, BHEL, or even the explosives or DRDO, you name them and they are there. Also university and educational institutions, hospitals, AIIMS was created during that period, so that we have a holistic development of science, technology and rational planning. So the concept of developmental state emerged during this period, which would be able to shape and reshape the aspirations of Indian citizens, and community development became the other side of the story. Partha Chatterjee, the whom we have been discussing throughout this course, argues that the way development was going on, particularly till the time Nehru was still alive, there were not many oppositions to that. But after the Nehru passed away, we witness, for example, the case of Chipko movement that we had discussed in the previous class. What we witnessed was that industrialization or an unchecked nature of industrialization was not an answer to the issues that were there in the Indian countryside. Because while we had capitalism or state capitalism or capital intensive industries, it was happening at the cost of primitive accumulation, where there was a shift of resources from agrarian sectors to more capital intensive industries. So, industrial growth was not about poverty eradication, rather industrial growth became growth for a very specific class of people, very specific caste of people, and again very specific region. So, while the regions around Delhi, whether it is Western Uttar Pradesh, Punjab, Haryana, as well as certain areas of Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan prospered, the other areas lagged behind. While certain areas like Roorkee, like Bokaro, like Salem, they were created as the points of great massive industries, nothing was there outside of it. So they became islands. Now, these islands were extracting resources. If this is an island, they were extracting resources from all their sides just to survive. So Bokaro's the steel city has Bokaro steel plant at its center, and it requires labor or cheap labor to work for it. So come the Adivasi laborers, but the educated classes were coming from Bihar, coming from West Bengal, coming from New Delhi, so on and so forth. So, and the resources were getting extracted through minings, and Adivasis were getting expropriated from these areas. Water was getting expropriated from the surrounding areas for this town and for the city to exist. So, what we see here is that it was creating more inequalities in society rather than equalities. The imagination of the early leaders, early nationalist leaders were absolutely fine, but the way they were implemented and the trickle down effect did not happen led to massive upsurge of anti-development discourses, in which development was understood as the primitive accumulation, development was understood as expropriation of resources from the poor, as well as massive expulsion of people from their rural habitats. So, within sociology of development, what are the key concerns? Now, one of the key concerns is how has modernization, the way it was visualized by Nehru, by others, impacted caste, kinship, agriculture and labor. Now, we have fascinating narratives about this. So, you can go through them, as particularly go through the ethnographic works. How has caste transferred itself to class? Is there death of kinship networks, or now is agriculture all commercial? Has everybody become rich, or has the labor force become part of a proletarianized economy? At the same time, what about the questions of tradition, hierarchy and social mobility? What is the population of people who have been able to be socially mobile, and if they have been able to be socially mobile, to what extent? So, can we link this social mobility with a certain form of social transformation? If so, what is the nature of it? Now, the structural changes are linked to the cultural continuity, which essentially means that despite the efforts towards modernization, tradition, hierarchy and social mobility were stigmatized or stymized. Tradition remained, and wherever people migrated, they took their caste, they took their kinship structures with them. So, caste did not vanish because you are working in a big factory. Rather, you realize that in your urban location, certain caste of people have become managers or are becoming managers, whereas certain caste of people are now sweepers. We can have fancy names for them, but that is how it is looked at. So, how does development as a problematic, development as a discourse, this development as an ideology sees these transformations or lack of transformations? Scholars like M. N. Srinivas would argue that modernization brought cultural processes of development via Sanskritization and Westernization, particularly through Westernization, because the technological institutions, colonial institutions and its values were adopted by the dominant caste and also many other non-dominant castes for social mobility. Similarly, A. R. Desai would argue that modernization itself is not neutral, because development is based on class. Only certain class of people get to feel developed or get to be part of the structure of economic growth, because the Indian state, according to this, needs to be seen as capitalist representing bourgeois interests. In other words, the Indian state, despite being or despite showing itself or claiming itself to be socialist, is actually capitalist. Now, the difference is between state capitalism and private capitalism. It is not socialism at all. So, the bourgeois here are not just the industrialists. The bourgeois here are also part of a certain class of people who are representing both state capitalism and who are representing private capitalism. So, that is the reason why the public sector reinforces capitalist expansion rather than socialist redistribution. Now, economic growth is again contrasted with redistribution, whether growth can actually have, if something is growing, can it have some trickle down effects? If not, then how do we manage redistribution? In our discussion on passive revolution, as well as of Sudipta Kaviraj, as well as the discussion that we had of Partha Chatterjee, as well as Kalyan Sanyal, we had seen that the redistribution, distribution or trickle down, if it is not happening, then in a democratic state, the state is giving certain kind of benefits to the dispossessed masses. So, welfare masks deepening exploitation and corruption. If that is not so, then how is it that some people are becoming billionaires, they own thousands of acres of land, whereas there are certain people or a great number of people who are just focusing on how to get 2 square meals a day, or how they can get those highly subsidized ration for themselves, without which there are chances that they might die of starvation or they might die of malnutrition. So the E.R. Desai would argue that development produces discontent among workers, peasants and the poor. But what A.R. Desai did not focus on was the issues related to gender, the issues related to caste, the issues related to environment, the issues related to region, as well as the intersections of patriarchy and how many a times new patriarchal forms are emerging because of the kind of developmental discourse that is being followed in the context of India. Arturo Escobar brings some of these ideas into frame by not just looking at the context of India, but rather looking at it at a global scale, and in which he argues that this development as discourse is the product of colonial power and Western dominance, in which in the post 1945 period, when most of the countries were getting the free, were getting their independence, institutions like World Bank, IMF and USAID were created to tell this newly emerging, newly developing as well as newly independent how to become developed. Now it's like the new age self-help books that we have, as well as the numerous podcasts that we have on YouTube or otherwise. When there is somebody who comes and tells you how to become a billionaire, now everybody can become at least a millionaire, if not a billionaire. And then they ask you to buy their books or their courses. Now, by buying their courses, the only person who is becoming a crorepati or a millionaire is the one who is selling their own products. So that's exactly the model that, according to Arturo Escobar, that was used by the Western countries in order to create poverty, illiteracy and backwardness as an idea, as an ideology, because of which the countries or the newly emerging countries have remained poor, and only when they consume this information from these institutions, then only they can come out of poverty and backwardness. So this was an ideological justification for a new form of influence. So that is the reason why Arturo Escobar calls this out, and he calls this out by looking at underdevelopment, dependency and ecological devastation as products of development discourse that were propagated by these kind of institutions. So he calls for the alternatives rooted in local cultures and pluriversality, that whatever is coming from the local cultures, whatever is context specific, they are good. Whatever is coming from the US and Western Europe is not so good, because every time one country from the global south follows the dictates or the suggestions of the global north, it's always the global north which benefits rather than the somebody from the global south. So that is how it all played out. And in the Indian context, again, the subaltern studies, the collective, they also looked at it in terms of what is not being critiqued, what is not being spoken about, both in the post-colonial period as well as in the pre-colonial period. And in this narrative of post-colonialism and pre-colonialism, they call it not colonial period and post-independence period, they rather call it as colonial period and post-colonial period, where they find a continuity and continuum of many of the ideas of progress, tradition and backwardness that were adopted and utilized by the British Empire and now being propagated by the Indian state. So, the what scholars like Gayatri Spivak caution here is that we have to understand subalternity as not just giving voice to somebody, but how to look at silencing as a structural problem, and what are the different ways through which it can be restored. So that's the reason why she wrote that now very famous essay called "Can the Subaltern Speak?" And her answer was no, a subaltern cannot speak. Now there are a lot of critiques of this work, so let us not get into it. You can, or if you're interested, you can read that for yourself. But suffice it to say that structural silencing is much deeper than somebody who cannot speak. If somebody is not able to speak, there could be reasons for that, but structural silencing means that every time you want to speak, there's somebody else who is speaking for you or speaking on behalf of you. That means you are being infantilized, that you as a child, you are a baby, you cannot speak for yourself, you cannot represent yourself, so let me represent you. And this is where the problematic lies, and this is where some of these things match up. So what are the alternatives to this idea of development? One of the ideas that we discussed was called pluriversality and decolonial futures, which means that the ideas about development needs to come from indigenous, Dalit, feminist and tribal movements. Why? Because they are people of the soil. They work, live and interact with the soil and its environment in a day-to-day life, and they are the ones who are at the bottom of the pyramid. So when they think about development, they not only think about themselves, but they also think how everybody's life can be made better. So that is the reason why when we reimagine development, it is about democratic, plural and justice oriented, and that can only happen when the groups who are at the bottom of this pyramid start thinking about this entire structure itself. Otherwise, when somebody at the top thinks about the structure, they only see themselves and everybody else who is down there, and they think or they feel and they decide that I have to give something to these people so that my position is never challenged. So pluriversality discusses all the layers of this pyramid, both vertical as well as horizontal, and how it can be a decolonial the force, how it can be done in a way where multiple voices or plural voices can be heard, acknowledged and brought to discussion. So these are a few discussion questions we have. So one question is development inherently a Western or colonial project, or can it be indigenized? If yes, then how? If no, then why not? And what would pluriversal development look like in the Indian context? Is this just a romantic or utopian idea, or there is some value to it? You can go through some of these readings. Thank you.